Hello, and welcome. For those who don't know me, I am Keith Burt, faculty here in the Department of Psychological Science, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this Burack Lecture Series event. A couple of logistical things I wanted to note right off the bat. First, there is going to be formal Q&A after the presentation today in here, and then we will adjourn after that to a catered reception at the Fireplace Lounge, Davis Center, just right down the hall that you passed on your way to the room. So please do join us for that so we can continue the conversation there. I also wanted to let you all know that this talk has been approved for continuing education credits. So if that is something you are eligible for and interested in, please sign in with Karen, who's right there waving her hand, and we can set you up with all of that info. So thanks very much. Our event today is co-sponsored by the Department of Psychological Science, the College of Nursing and Health Sciences, and the Vermont Center for Children, Youth, and Families. And our guest is Jelena Obradovic. Jelena completed her BA summa cum laude from Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, and earned her MA and PhD from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities with concentration in developmental psychology and a minor in statistics. She did her postdoc at the University of British Columbia, and since 2009, she has been a faculty member at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University, recently earning tenure and promotion to associate professor. Jelena is a rising star in the world of developmental psychology and developmental psychopathology, with over 50 peer-reviewed published journal articles, many in the top journals in her field. Her work has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health and the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, among many other sources. She was a successful candidate for the highly selective William T. Grant Faculty Scholars Program. She received the Early Career Research Contribution Award from the Society for Research in Child Development, and has in her young career secured other awards for her academics and scholarship that are too numerous for me to list here today. On a personal level, Jelena is a wonderful collaborator and colleague. She has a rare combination of insight and tenacity to her work. She's a gifted communicator and a deep thinker, and truly a role model for how to tackle tough topics and do high-quality programmatic research in psychology. Her work has already inspired and helped influence faculty and graduate student research on developmental psychology and developmental psychopathology here at UVM. So for all of these reasons, I am more than thrilled to welcome to our campus Jelena Obradovic, who will speak today on self-regulation in children and their caregivers, implications for adaptation and resilience in early childhood. Please join me in welcoming Jelena.
Well, he promised a very brief introduction, and now I'm like, tearful starting this talk. So thank you, Keith, for an amazing introduction and for all your work and everybody else's work to bring me here. It's such an honor and pleasure to be here and to tell you a little bit about my work, which really sits at the intersection of three systems that I'm going to try to talk to you about today. One is the self-regulation on behavioral level of children, stress physiology on biological, and then on environmental. I'll talk a little bit about family experiences and family context. And there's a little asterisk there. If I am fast enough, I may get to the fourth chapter that a little bit tackles some of these processes in the context of schools and some of the scale-up efforts that we're trying to do when we come to measuring these processes at kind of population level. So because I've been told that this is a diverse audience with very different backgrounds, I'm going to give a little bit of introduction to what I mean by different constructs. So self-regulation is a really broad construct. Today, I'm going to primarily talk about executive functioning skills. These are higher order cognitive skills that help children and adults regulate their attention, their behavior, their emotion. There's three components, three kind of basic components that researchers have agreed on. One is inhibitory control. This is a set of skills that develop really early in childhood and really helps us suppress impulsive thoughts and action, be able to kind of ignore the distraction and temptation, stay focused and attentive to what we are doing. also inhibit our prepotent responses, so our motor responses, kind of wait, take turns. Then there's working memory, which is really a set of skills that help us kind of hold and update information. It could be verbal and nonverbal information in our heads, help us kind of go through multi-step procedure tasks. And the last one, kind of the most advanced skill, is cognitive flexibility, which is really allowing children to shift flexibly between competing demands or rules, and to kind of adapt to kind of changing demands of their environment. So before I tell you why it's important to study these set of skills, I want to show kind of a little quick video to demonstrate one of the tasks that we use to measure these set of skills in the kind of lab context. So this is a peg tapping task, and the kid is instructed that when the experimenter taps once, the child should tap twice, and then when the experimenter taps twice, the child should inhibit, kind of mimicking the experimenter, and tap once. So very simple rules. We've adapted this for use in rural Pakistan, as I'll tell you later about. But I want you to see how there's even to this task, there's a process of kind of recognition and as child performs. So let's see.
Are you ready now? It gets fancy at the end. Okay, so why study executive functioning?
So at first, I argued that it's a really basic set of skills, kind of a building blocks that help us enable children to pursue goal-directed behavior. And it can be any kind of goal-directed behavior that they want to engage in. And as such, they're really important in kind of setting certain developmental trajectories in motion. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. And also, they tend to be an important protective factor. So not only they're important for any children growing up, but especially important in kind of high-risk adverse contexts. So how do we know this? So there's a lot of literature showing that EFs support adaptation in early childhood, both in the cognitive domain, everything from transition to kindergarten, school readiness, engagement, adaptive classroom behaviors, how well children know to sit still, raise their hands, engage with peers, stay on task. But we also show that changes in executive functioning can support growth in very academic, like math and reading skills. And then on the socio-emotional side, we know that children who have a higher executive functioning skills also do better in terms of pro-social behaviors, dealing with their own behavioral and kind of emotional problems, and as a result have a lot less conflictual and more supportive relationship with their parents as well as the teachers. We have recently done work with middle childhood, so we know that brain areas that support this set of skills continue to develop and mature into early adulthood, and so we're not surprised that changes in this set of skills also support school success in middle childhood. So we see children having higher levels of task orientation, assertiveness, frustration tolerance, peer social skill, and less acting out as reported by teachers in elementary school. And another thing that we find is that these changes, this is where we're trying to get at rigorous, that changes in EF during an academic year promote changes, longitudinal changes in achievement over time. Now, we are not the only ones studying this in older kids. This is a Moffitt article from 2011 that really shows that when you look at childhood EFs, really early on has kind of repercussion for adulthood. So what you see here is you see poor physical health, substance dependence, two different kind of measures of substance dependence, then socioeconomic status, financial painfulness, financial struggles. And basically what you see is that the higher levels of EF in childhood are associated with the lowest levels of financial problems, health problems, economic problems, and the children who have highest level of EF in childhood have kind of best outcomes in adulthood. Now, I quickly want to say that it's not all about self-regulation and executive function. It's not a magic bullet. It's not the only one thing. And this is why I'm sure this is a complicated figure, but I want to demonstrate something that it's really important that during transitions, a very critical kind of salient periods like during kindergarten. So here we have measures in fall of kindergarten, spring of kindergarten, and first grade, spring of first grade. We show that children who start lacking these set of skills, who are inattentive and impulsive, even though there's stability of those behaviors, and we know that those behaviors in the moment can affect closeness and conflict and school engagement with in the moment, both with teachers as well as their school engagement. What we see with these set of skills is that they start these cascades. The children who start kindergarten lacking this set of skills tend to increase in conflict during kindergarten year. They tend to like school less at the end of the kindergarten year. And then those things kind of spill over to their adaptation in the first grade. So it's not just that the self-regulation in itself matters, but it matters in connecting with teachers, in liking the school, and then those other things also matter later on. So it starts these kind of developmental cascades that could have repercussions for later behavior. We have also looked at it as a protective factor in a homeless population of kids who are at really high end of risk distribution, who live in homeless shelters. And we find that when we compare it to parenting quality and intelligence, some of other kind of key protective factors, that this really emerges as a differentiation between those who succeed, who are what we would call resilience in this context, from those that struggle in one of the domains, whether that's academic functioning, social competence, behavior, or even health well-being. So these set of skills matter. They matter for all the kids for different reasons, but they definitely matter in the context of risk and adversity. The other reasons why I think executive functioning are a powerful process to study is they can be measured and construed in a very culturally universal way. They depend less, tasks can be designed in such a way that they depend less on the specific educational and cultural experiences. And as such, they give us a more ecologically valid way to get the capacity and kind of promise of children from low and middle income countries. So it doesn't have to be, kind of like the traditional IQ test, which really depends on certain types of schooling and your familiarity with a certain context for us to get a sense of your developmental potential and your developmental experience. The other thing I highlighted here is it can also serve as a powerful proxy for neurodevelopment. So in a context where it's very hard to get kids imaged or look at their brain development, we can use this set of skills. And we have shown in our Pakistan sample, my good colleague and friend Amanda Tarul at Boston University have shown neurocorrelates of executive functioning that match what we know from high-income country samples that are very similar in our low-income Pakistan, rural Pakistan sample. Now, because it's such a great marker of early development as well as a proxy of neurodevelopment, it's also susceptible to environmental influences. And so unfortunately, even though it matters for resilience and it matters in context of risk and adversity, we see huge gaps in children's executive functioning when we look at low and high-income samples in the United States. And so what you see on this side, this is a work by Sybil Raver. She has basically just graphed the measures of executive function at 48 months of age, so early childhood, as a function of years of your life that you spent in poverty. And so you can see very steep gradient that the longer your family had income that was below poverty threshold, the lower your executive functioning skill are. And then on this side, you see a picture looking at a kind of level of working memory composite. So one of the aspects of executive functioning from age 10 to age 18. And it's graphed by 25 percentile income median and 75 percentile income on parent education. And you see very clear gaps as a function of parental education that do not close, that kind of persist over this period of time. This Socioeconomic disparity is also seen at the level of biology, both at the level of structure and function when it comes to brain. So here we have a really great study showing kind of decoupling of brain structure and executive functioning performance. So what they've shown is that looking at the white matter integrity and volume, there's a high correlation between the white matter integrity and volume and performance on cognitive flexibility task, but that is true only from children who come from low-income backgrounds. Children who come from high-income backgrounds, which is this flat line here, you see complete decoupling of their brain structure and their performance on cognitive flexibility tasks. So again, it is the low-income children that have that effect. And then in terms of function, this is again a complicated graph, but you should just see that the red means more activation, blue means less activation, and then here we have an easier EF task, and here we have a harder EF tasks. And so then what you see is that children who come from low-income backgrounds, they tend to activate their brains a lot more when it comes to easy tasks. So higher income children don't need to activate their brains as much when there is an easy EF task, but when there is a hard EF task, we see a complete opposite pattern. So it's, again, we have very clear differentiation by income when it comes to brain functioning in context of executive functioning. So what is going on? SES is a very broad marker of diversity and inequality. So one of the things that I want to highlight is the role of stress. And there's a couple of studies that in kind of quasi-experimental and experimental way have shown how stress can undermine both development of executive functioning but also performance in the moment. So Patrick Sharkey is a great sociologist that has kind of taken a very interesting approach. He looked at a Chicago school readiness sample, and he had looked geographically where in Chicago homicides occurred within 7 days of children coming in to be tested on their executive functioning. And so he was able to set up, obviously the scheduling of these assessments and, the temporal sequence of these homicides in Chicago, are completely random. And so what he was able to show that children who came after an incidence of homicide in their neighborhood, that affected their performance and executive functioning. And it was a clear function of how close geographically you were and how much time has passed since that experience in your neighborhood. And then Mani et al. Did an interesting task with adults, both in India and in US, basically trying to see whether worries about finances or about success of harvesting will affect your performance on kind of executive functioning tasks. And they find that, yes, worrying about finances, especially if you're poor and you come from low-income backgrounds, has a direct effect on your performance when it comes to these higher-order cognitive self-regulatory skills. So this brings us to kind of the second chapter of my talk, which is stress physiology. So stress obviously affects our biology and our bodies. And so for those who this is, a new construct. When we anticipate as well as experience challenging or stressful environments, our bodies respond to that. And they respond with a set of neurophysiological actions that basically prepares us to cope with these challenges and adapt to these stressors. And we also see a huge variability in how children respond to these experiences, right? So some children may experience very dramatic changes to their heart rate, sweating, to their breathing, whereas some may have less of a pronounced response. Now, these responses are very healthy, they're adaptive, but what happens is that over a longer time, this process of allostasis or process of adapting to these external stressors and demands starts having a long-term changes to your body. And so these changes are helpful in the short term, but over long term, they can really wear and tear your body. And that's what we call allostatic load. And so stress physiology has played a really important role in understanding how adversity and these adverse stressful experiences get kind of a biologically embedded and expressed and affect our adaptation and outcomes. And so stress physiology plays a big role, as Blair and Raver hypothesized, and there's data now coming to support this model, that in explaining how adversity, quality of caregiving, as well as your genetic background may get funneled in affecting kind of the neural development and neural basis of self-regulation. And obviously there's some important feedback loops back. But what I want to tell you a little bit about today is really conceptualizing stress physiology as a marker of differential susceptibility. So it can get embedded in these early experiences, definitely make a difference and contribute to your kind of response profile when you encounter these experiences. Now, children who have heightened, or what we call high reactive profile, have for many years conceptualized as vulnerable children, almost as if they had kind of a double whammy. They were reactive, and if they're in a context of high adversity, they will be worse off. And then Tom Boyce and Bruce Ellis came in 2005 and articulated this theory called biological sensitivity to context. Since then, it's been kind of reframed into differential susceptibility to context. But the notion is that this reactivity is not a marker of vulnerability, but rather a marker of susceptibility or sensitivity to your experiences. And so they came up with this great metaphor to explain this theory, in that the high reactive kids are kind of like an orchid's children. They're really sensitive. And so if they are raised in adverse contexts, they're just more susceptible to that adversity, and they're going to do worse off than the low reactive kids. Whereas if they come from very supportive and nurturing contexts, they will thrive and flourish and actually do better than their low reactive peers. While low reactive kids are kind of like dandelions, and they are just less sensitive and less affected by their environmental context. And so we published a series of papers showing this moderation model, showing that indeed, if you look at, blue line is a low reactive kids, red line is high reactive kids, and here we measured family adversity as determined by 6 different measures, so a very kind of comprehensive sense of their family background. And this is just one outcome of many that we published in this paper. But you see this classic interaction that for kids who are highly reactive, that relationship between family adversity and school engagement is much stronger. And indeed, in the context of high adversity, they show lowest level of adaptation, in this case, school engagement, whereas in the low levels, which we would assume, although that shouldn't be always assumed, kind of nurturing, low adverse, supportive environments, they show the highest, the best school engagement. Now, our colleagues at NYU have looked at infant temperamental reactivity and shown similar differential susceptibility. So this is not biological reactivity, it's a temperament reactivity, but we see same interactions of economic hardship and then executive functioning at age 48 months. Again, the high reactive kids are these steep line that show the lowest executive functioning if they come from impoverished families, and then if they don't come impoverished, they actually end up having highest level of executive functioning. So recently, we wanted to push these 2 pieces of work and see, can we indeed find evidence of susceptibility, differential susceptibility on executive functioning tasks with the biologist? So for many studies, the way we proven this concept of biological sensitivity to context is we would bring kids to the lab, we would measure their biological response, and then we would either survey parents or teachers on outcomes much later and kind of separate, and then we would show that yes, indeed, children are differentially susceptible to the environments. So what we did in this study is we looked at their performance on EF tasks, and we also looked at cortisol response during that performance, during their lab visit. And indeed, we find, and this is a community sample, so it's really important to point out that this is not just risk and non-risk sample, but even with the kind of natural variability of family income in the community sample, we see striking evidence of differential susceptibility across multiple measures of independent measures of executive functioning. So you have here cool EF skills like inhibitory control and working memory. We have delay of gratification task. And then we even have observers' own independent report of self-regulation during the whole assessment. And we see, again, that this red line, children, if they come from high-income families, they do better on the tasks. If they come from lower-income families, they do worse on the task. Whereas children who didn't have high reactivity when it comes to cortisol, they're just less affected by their family income. And so we're really trying to understand why. What are these processes, dynamic processes, that potentially this reactivity really enhances performance for some and undermines for others. And so out of this research has come a question of, if you tie this back to resilience, people would ask me, like, well, does that mean that, like, resilient kids are all dandelions? Like, are they all low reactive? And, if you really follow just the theory, the answer would be yes. But that really hasn't really sat well with me to just say, all the resilient kids have to be low reactive kids, because, resilient kids are resilient because they're positive and nurturing experiences in the context of high adversity, right? So they must be the one more sensitive and more being able to capitalize on these protective factors in their environment. And so that pushed us to thinking more, about stress physiology as adaptive process in itself. And even Keith and I wrote a paper kind of thinking more in a dynamic way and kind of trying to understand how do you conceptualize and measure and score different stress reactivity, that it's not just a single score. It felt like single score, just attaching a single score to children felt really obscuring some really important differences. We don't have orchids and dandelions just walking among us. Nobody's like just low reactive or high reactive. And so I got this really interested in this concept of recovery. And this is a theoretical paper that basically kind of hypothesized, the difference between children who have a high reactivity, high arousal response, and then they recover. They just calm themselves down, right? Versus the children who have a high reactivity but then stay aroused for much longer, right? And it's those kids that are most vulnerable to negative consequences of stress physiology, because they're basically flooding their brain with the stress hormones for much longer than is necessary. So it's not just about how you react, but more how do you recover. And so, moving from the metaphor, and all the great metaphors have their limitations, that, children are just like flowers, we started modeling stress physiology as a process, and the process that really captures stress arousal while children encounters that anticipatory as they start, what they do when they engage with the task, and then also what they do when they recover. And so we measure stress physiology in these epochs that helped us use piecewise growth curve trajectories. And we find one of the findings is that when you look at kind of the trajectory of engaging with the task, and this is a kind of a sociocognitive task, we see that children who have good executive functioning skills, especially the cool EF skills, so the working memory, inhibitory control, what they do is, yes, they show reactivity, they show arousal, and then they plateau. They show initial arousal and they plateau. But what was most interesting to us, what we got really excited about, is when we looked at recovery, and we found out that children who perform high on delay of gratification task and who were rated by our observers as being most well-regulated during their visit to the lab, they are the ones who showed much steeper recoveries after the challenge have passed. After we said, the challenge have passed, you can just sit and relax, they're the ones who basically recover much faster. Okay, so that brings us to family system, okay? So what can we do to foster these processes of, both biological and behavioral regulation? So one of the experiences that have been highlighted in literature is this notion of parental scaffolding. So these are set of behaviors that parents can do, practices that really are supporting children's autonomy. They're promoting and praising and kind of elaborating, maintaining, redirecting attention, really scaffolding children's cognitive development in kind of broad sense. And then separately from that, there's a hypothesis that these children who kind of come from a very nurturing or high-income environments, parents just invest a lot more into their cognitive stimulation. They buy toys, they engage them in extracurricular activities, they can maybe afford more, better childcare, but there's these structural things that are just promoting higher levels of stimulation. So we, a colleague of mine, Aisha Yousafzai, who at the time of the study was at Aga Khan University in Karachi, Pakistan, she started this RCT, 2x2 RCT trial in Sindh province to really look at the effects of responsive contingent behaviors, parenting intervention, and then coupled or not coupled with nutrition intervention. So she recruited a birth cohort of 1,400 families, and she basically ran an intervention through their lady health worker system, which is kind of a backbone health system in Pakistan, especially rural Pakistan. And so these moms and children were then followed. We got a grant together to follow them at age 4 and really try to understand what are the longitudinal effects of these interventions that really focus on kind of scaffolding the play and interaction. I'll tell you a little bit about the sample. So it's a big sample. They were followed then at birth, 18, 24, 48 months. It's a really high-risk sample. So 2/3 of mom were illiterate. They never attended school. There are really high levels of depression. And they also experience high levels of food insecurity. So this was our chance to really take our developmental science into global setting, into low and middle income country, and see how do these processes work in concert together. And so we focused on the ECD intervention. Sorry. We focus on the ECD intervention, which is based on the UNICEF and WHO. They have this module called Care for Child Development, and really focuses on play. It focuses on activities that these moms can do with kind of ordinary objects they can find in household, where they can, learn how to talk and take turns with their infant, how to stack and maybe cups or use spoons to bang on those cups, how to make some very low-cost toys, and they get a lot of observation, coaching, feedback. They get monthly visits, and then they have some group meetings where they kind of learn about child development in general. And so because it's such a rich data set that had very in-depth measures at 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, and then 48 months, both of family context as well as this direct observation of mother-child interaction, we were able to kind of tease apart both how does the intervention that focuses on these behaviors does it affect executive functioning? And does it affect through this home stimulation investment or through these specific behaviors? And what we found out is that yes, the intervention still had an effect on age 4 executive functioning. This is a very simplified model because we also controlled for IQ and verbal reasoning, and we find that the effects on executive functioning were actually stronger than it was on IQ. But we also find that pathways through which this intervention worked. And we found that the pathways were more reliably and consistently working through this observed scaffolding that happened within a dyad than maybe these structural changes of the home that really had kind of much more continuous and stable measure over time in terms of what family could invest and what family provided. And were much more predicted by education and income, wealth there, than by maternal behaviors. So at this point, I want to segue really quickly because I often get from audiences who are maybe not interested in research, kind of like, what can I take from this? What are you talking? What should I do with the kids? What kind of practices? And so Harvard has this Center on Developing Child, and they have put together this fantastic PDF that really summarizes activities across a range of ages that could be used with children to promote this set of skills. And probably to no surprise to many of you here, and it's so much is about playing, and so much play that happens in different ages is already building executive functioning skills. And it's the best way to foster this set of skills because there's a high reward. It's so pleasurable to play. And it's in the context of positive emotions. And so even though we often look at children executive functioning in the context of negative emotions, when we really want them to regulate their behavior, you know, they're best exercised in the context of exuberance and excitement, right? So when you think about hiding games, there's a lot that kids learn about managing the suspense or following the sequence, or when you do the singing rhymes, there is anticipatory reaction. Even when you do Itsy Bitsy Spider, you have to wait. When is the term? When do you do it? When do you not do it? There's a lot of gestures and chants and repetition that helps. As kids get older, they engage in role play, and role play has enormous amount of taxing executive functioning, both from inhibiting to step in when it's not your time, being flexible about changing the rules and scripts, controlling your impulses, taking turns, flexibly adjusting if somebody comes up with some new idea. So there's a lot, again, that happens in a context of playing, role-playing. Similarly, as kids get older, physical activities and games, board games, dancing, cooking, there's just so much that naturally happens during play that, you know, promotes this set of skills. And then not to leave you with just playing, you know, research shows that even the conversation help with the focusing attention, taking turns, ignoring distraction. We have a growing body of research showing the bilingual experience can also promote this set of skills. Storytelling, a lot of things that happens in kind of family context, you know, developing these routines, skills, monitoring can make a difference. But segueing back to our research, we were really interested in the context, in the construct of co-regulation. So we know that, you know, often it doesn't matter what you do, but how you do it. And the self-regulation really comes from, initially from this dyadic co-regulation. Parents play such a big role in regulating the arousal of the child. From infant-parent synchrony, attachment security, sensitivity, contingent responding, positive control. And so we take advantage of this new, relatively new analysis approach called state space grid analysis, which really enables you to measure these micro-social experiences between a dyad. And so we constructed as a co-regulation space. Okay? And we look at these mutually exclusive states in which child can be and in which parent can be. So child can be actively on task, it can be passively on task, it can be withdrawn or disengaged, or it can be defiant or dysregulated. To those experiences, they're kind of mutually exclusive and kind of encompassing the experience, the parent can engage in positive control, following child's lead, can completely disengage themselves, or they can engage in negative control. And so we take this space and we say, okay, in this zone, this gray zone, this is our zone of positive co-regulation. This is where no matter how child acts, parent is appropriately responding. And then we look at second-by-second interactions and try to understand how much time dyads together spend in this region. And if they leave that region because somebody gets dysregulated, withdrawn, or disengaged, how long does it take them to come back? Right? And then if they're inside there, how stable their behavior is inside there. And so there's a lot of studies coming out with this, this dynamic system state grid analysis, we call it SSG. But what really I was curious about it is it's really a lot of work. It's extremely extensive to second-by-second code this. And so we have these great observational global codes of parents, right? That has worked so well for us in such a long time, right? And so for me, I really needed to know that there was an added value to the global observational codings. And so what we did in the studies, we looked at these gold standards measure of being emotionally supportive and available, monitoring child's performance, providing appropriately timely feedings, but in a very global way. You kind of watch the whole interaction and then you rate at the end and pitted that global ratings against these microsocial second-by-second ratings. And what we found, this is, by the way, the picture, before I tell you what we found. This is a picture of a one dyad. This is what that looks like, right? what we found is in the path analysis, when we put this global and microsocial, and then we ask teacher to report on kind of self-regulated behavior in the classroom, so again, to separate the reporter and the context, we find that these microsocial measures actually uniquely predict children's self-regulation in the classroom context, whereas global measures, even though bivariately they're related and without microsocial they would predict, and there is obviously correlation between the microsocial and global ratings, the global ratings don't pan out. So finally, we feel like, okay, good. So one, at least they're worth doing. The other thing that was really curious to us is that income, family income is a lot more related to the global ratings. And made us start thinking whether even us as a kind of independent observers, are we just more sensitive when we give global ratings to kind of family economic background to some extent, whereas when you're really focusing on kind of the state in which child and independently parent is second by second, you cannot bring your kind of biases into that coding as much as you would in global. Okay, so it's great. It matters. Parents matter. There's a lot they can do. But how many of you are parents here in the audience? Okay, so as you'll know, parenting also strains parents' own executive function and emotional regulation, right? So it's not always able to, provide such a nurturing scaffolding and also be there and present and co-regulate them, especially if you had a hard and difficult day, right? And so we started, as others have too, being interested in parents' own executive functioning and their own parenting, how that supports their parenting behavior. And so, to no surprise, parents who have a greater executive functioning, they show less harsh and reactive parenting. They show greater maternal sensitivity. And even in our Pakistan sample, we were able to show that even in that context, having higher levels of EF promotes more maternal scaffolding. That scaffolding that was like our main mediators of intervention effect is really supported by maternal cognitive capacity, independent of maternal wealth and other things, other global things. And then recently, again, a good friend of mine, colleague Ann Schaefer, and I started trying to pit emotion regulation and executive functioning. So executive functioning and emotional regulations are related constructs, but they're a little bit different, and they're measured in a different way. And so what we did in the path analysis, we really wanted to see, is there a difference when it comes to parenting behaviors? And so what we see here, we have these global ratings of sensitive and responsive parenting. This is kind of like what parents really do. It's really driven by parent. And then below here, we have observed and rated just the dyadic climate, the kind of the observational. Are dyad enjoying each other? Is there a conflict there? And what we find is that parent inhibitory control, directly measure, really predicts that kind of sensitive and responsive behavior. But parents' own emotion regulation, how well they're able to regulate their own distress, really predicts the kind of the positive and collaborative and kind of the climate, the emotional climate of a dyad. Another thing that was really surprising and kind of interesting to us is that inhibitory control is really predicted by the kind of your typical SES factors, so financial stress and education, whereas emotion regulation were predicted by social support that the parent had in their lives, right? So that there is some unique pathways probably by which parents develop their emotion regulation strategy that may be different from their just pure executive functioning. So we talked about two generational approaches to supporting the self-regulation in both children and caregivers, especially in those that come from very stressful and kind of chaotic contexts. And so, as I say at this point, it's like, so relax, this is easy, just relax. And maybe it doesn't look like this, now that you have children, maybe it looks more like this. But, it is about taking care of yourself. And it's not just for parents, it's also for teachers. We developed these great curriculums to ask teachers to implement it. But at the end of the day, it is how well regulated and how they are when they walk into their classroom, when you walk into that bedroom, or when you pick up your child from the daycare. Now, I wanted to, in the context of this, tell you a little bit about another study that I'm really excited about, because ever since I got interested in resilience, I was always fascinated by the notion of a ceiling effect or inoculation effect. And this is this idea that Michael Rutter has always written about, how, exposure to some challenges and some stressors can actually be promotive and good and can kind of build resilience. And because then later in life, you can kind of encounter challenges and say, like, oh, I can do this. Like, I went through some adversity, I can do this, right? But we've never got good kind of developmental data to show that this is true. And so in kind of general context of, helicopter parenting and trying to protect our children from any kind of negative experiences, we looked at parental challenges, and we grouped them in kind of socioeconomic challenges. So in that, it would be education, income, but also financial stress, as well as their subjective socioeconomic status, which we know makes a difference. And then separately from that, we asked them to report on their emotional challenges. So marital challenges, parenting load, a little bit of, actually the next slide is going to list them all. Parental challenges, oh, no, not here, I took it off. But just kind of like the emotional climate of the family, right? So how well they're regulating themselves, how well they're in their kind of marital, as well as with their child. And so what we found is, before I tell you about these graphs, we found, as it would be expected, that the socioeconomic challenges had this very linear effect on the EFs. The more socioeconomic challenge they had, the lower the EF of these kids were, right? But the emotional challenges had this unique and additive effect. But even more, it had a nonlinear effect. So we often think our theories are very dynamic and very nonlinear, and yet we often kind of cram those linear effects and just test those linear effects. And so what we found is that for cool EF, and this is directly measured cool EF, so working memory and inhibitory control, we find that the peak levels of EFs was actually at kind of mild to moderate levels of parental challenges. But when it came to hot EF and kind of emotion regulation, actually we found that it's kind of really the moderate level. This is a community sample, so it's very within the context of community. That's the more moderate challenges is where the EFs peak. And actually our delay of gratification, which is our direct task of hot EF, actually had a positive linear effect. So the more challenges you experience, the better your emotional regulation skills were. And so within the context, again, I'm going to repeat, community sample that doesn't experience a lot of, so in the paper we talk about what one standard deviation really is, what 0 is, and we kind of break it down to kind of anchor this measure. So it's not a lot of challenges, it's very limited challenge exposure. But you can see that in this context, maybe children are asked to regulate and to be, engaging those emotion regulation skills more. And maybe over the time, that practice gets them better. So, it's a kind of an avenue that we would love to pursue more. I think I have a few minutes, so I'm going to take those. Okay, all right, great. So self-regulation at scale. So one of the things that have really bothered me ever since my graduate school days is that how we test and measure these things. And one of the things that we do is, most of you know, we do all our tests in a lab setting with this one-on-one situation where we have assessors who are very trained to establish really good positive report with the child. We give them a lot of stickers and smile. We tell them that they're doing great. And even when we test them, even though we may not give them feedback right then in that moment, we're kind of next to them and we look over them, and there's just a lot of these incentives and motivators that just don't exist in a real life setting, right? So then we ask them to go in the classrooms of 20, 25, 30 kids, and they have to engage this set of skills in the kind of the hubbub of that experience, which is very different how we tested them, okay? So that has been kind of a motivation. The other thing is, it's really resource intensive to, let's say, pull a child one at a time or to recruit large samples to come to your lab. It's really resource heavy. And yet, we know the benefits of direct assessment over teacher report or self-report or even parent report. So there's something to say about these tasks. The other thing, it's very disruptive. So I don't know how many of you do work in school settings, but teachers and school districts don't want to approve these paradigms where you're going to pull one kid at a time from the classroom. And as a result, we get these non-representative samples. samples, right? So we may get 5 kids from the classroom, not everybody in the classroom, which doesn't really approximate, what that environment looks like. And so what we did is, for this one study, that we developed basically group assessment procedure to improve this ecological validity, but also to be able to assess all the kids at the same time on these tablet-based tasks. We basically adapted 4 executive functioning tasks for the tablet computers, and we created a protocol where we can walk into the classroom and assess all the kids at the same time, very similar to how teachers may lead an activity with a kind of teacher's aid. And we wanted to validate that. We wanted to show that, yes, indeed, this can substitute individual assessment. And so we created this random subsample of kids who then completed the assessment in both settings, in group setting, and then half of them repeated it before a group assessment and half of them after group assessment to kind of even out the practice effect. And then we compared. We basically pitted this against this individual assessment to the group assessment. And there's a lot more in this paper, but basically we found convergent validity of EF across 2 performance settings. So they are measuring similar things. We also found that internally, this battery of 4 tasks and a little bit more composites had a very similar, to the second decimal points, had a similar internal reliability. And it had almost identical correlates with demographic and teacher report behavioral data. But what really got us excited is that EF performance in both settings uniquely predicted teacher reports of self-regulated behavior, but when it came to predicting just change in achievement over time of a 2-year period, it is the group assessment that was actually a better and the only predictor of growth in math and English performance. So we're excited about that because we showed that there is ability to really scale up this measurement in a different kind of way. And so this research and what I've been telling you before has having us now working on an expanded battery of tasks that are tablets-based, that can be administered in group assessment and individual assessment, but that go beyond executive functioning to measure things like persistence and challenge preference, so these motivational forces that have been neglected for a long time in executive functioning work. It's not just like that whether do you have skills, but do you care enough to actually implement those set of skills? And we have a paper that shows that these challenge preference and EF can have a compensatory effect. So for children who are low in EF, if they care to engage in more challenging tasks, they do better off than if they don't. So there's an interactive space there. And then also trying to design measures of emotion regulation that are relevant to challenges that children experience in the school context. So a lot of our emotion regulation work come from studies of families who experience abuse and neglect, and look at those kind of emotional challenges and how we respond to those. Whereas in school context, the challenges are very different, especially challenges to kind of the learning experience. And so with that, I'm going to finish and say thank you. And I want to acknowledge many. I'm here, but all of these people have incredibly contributed to my thinking and my work, from my lab to my collaborators, many undergraduates, district teachers who really open their doors, and families who welcome us and help us collect this data. So, any questions?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jelena, for that wonderful talk. I would ask for people to have questions. I'm going to bring the microphone over to you just because this talk is being recorded, and so that way we can get the question as well on the record.
So I don't know exactly what your population sample included in terms of possible disorders or other kinds of things like that. I'm thinking of children and adults on the autism spectrum in this picture. If I were to look at it anecdotally, I would say that you would have on these criteria very, very heavy-duty dysfunction, executive dysfunction in these domains there. And I wonder how you would kind of manage something like that I think was probably beyond the kinds of interventions that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I don't look at per se that population. This morning, I was talking to Patty about her research, and she says, it is definitely that population has deficits, but that's not maybe the most diagnostic. It's not like their main deficits. So it's such a broad population. I think that if I was organizing an intervention around, I don't think that executive functioning would be the key component. I think I would more focus on emotional regulation and kind of the aspects of how unpredictable the environment is, right? And how do you cope with those challenges when things don't go according to your plan, right? So it's kind of the cognitive flexibility, but within the context of emotion. And that's another thing that I think is a great point, because we started thinking a lot about, executive functioning got a lot of press about how relevant it is for school readiness, learning, behaviors, but it's really, we measure it in this very non-emotional way, right? And yet, everything that kids need to regulate even their attention or behavior, it is in the context of emotional challenges. And so I think there's a lot more work to be done, but first I think you need to start with better measures and understanding what does that look like in kind of ecologically valid or naturalistic setting, as they engage, where their self-regulation is challenged and in what way.
Other questions? Yes, Cassie.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was very illuminating in so many ways. One question I have as a non-child focused person is something we hear about a lot on the news now is all the research out there on grit, this construct that we're trying to engender in children, especially in low-income environments, in order to promote success. And I wonder what your perspective is, especially what you just said about measuring these things in thoughtful ways, about what the overlap is between this executive functioning, emotion regulation potion,
right,
and this grit construct, right, that we're all so fascinated by right now and wanting to create and promote in children.
Right. So I think I see grit kind of like a cumulative risk index in some ways. It's a very powerful predictor, but it's kind of like just sums up a lot of stuff in children's lives. So, and this is how we started, in kind of risk and resilience research, where we just count all the good stuff and all the bad stuff. And if you count them up at a certain age, lo and behold, it predicts 20 years later. But like, there was no lot about processes. The other thing that I find a little bit challenging with grit is the measurement piece. Like a lot of it is self-report and report of a lot of different things, and so it's really hard when you have such a broad measures, and especially with self-report, it comes the bias. The people with the track record of succeeding are more likely to report, having higher level skills. So I would love to see a more direct measure, and it's, it's actually this interest that is now in grit, or now people call socio-emotional learning, that really got us, and some districts have really ran with that. And we have, in California, we have these core districts that are really even built these measures like growth mindset and, self-efficacy and self-management as a part of their school accountability system. And yet, they kind of like ran with it, but they don't know now what they're assessing. And they're realizing, oh, teachers are not really great reporters of beliefs, student beliefs in age 5 and 6, And so they conflated like beliefs with skills. They conflated emotion regulation skills with executive functioning skills, which co-occur but not necessarily, right? And lo and behold, it's that self-management that picks up all the variance because it's most easiest to observe. Self-efficacy is really hard to observe in kindergarten kids. And so I'm working really closely with the SFU, San Francisco Unified School District, both in like trying to help them improve they actually got these items on their report cards, so that they're really serious about this. And so really trying to help them improve. But the more I go into that work, the more I'm like, oh, let's backtrack a little bit and let's measure just persistence, or let's figure out the task that measure frustration tolerance, right? Or let's look at these, so challenge preference, let's look at these constructs for which we have literature and we have some measurement. but it's not great. And it's not great for several different reasons. It's not great because it was never developed for schools. And it was never developed to be sensitive enough to measure, let's say, change, right? So we wanna improve, let's say, grit or persistence or growth mindset, right? But these are very, you know, the way we measured challenge preference long ago is by this, like, do you choose a difficult task or challenge puzzle or less difficult challenge? It's a binary response, right? And so it's not a very sensitive response to then track progress. And so what we're trying to do is not only develop a set of skills that really measure these processes at kind of individual level, and let's see if they're all just, you know, coming together, or maybe they interact in an interesting way, but also try to expand the performance metrics so that they are more dynamic and more sensitive, and we can capture more variability in kids. So we're trying to really be kind of creative in how to do that. So I'm interested in the construct, but, you know, I feel like a lot got kind of packaged into that. And yes, it's very predictive, but it has a lot of methodological constraints, I think. And I think people have recognized that. I think there was a...
Yes, here and here.
So again, thank you for that. I really was looking forward to this and greatly enjoyed it. One thing that I was wondering about when you talked about the recovery from like emotionally evocative tasks. I don't know what the stimuli were that evoked whatever sort of emotional response, but what it made me wonder about was if you've looked at like positive versus negative valenced emotions and how those curves might differ based on the type of based on that.
Right. So we didn't use the emotional challenge. We used are you familiar with the Trier task? We kind of used the child version of a Trier task. We basically asked children to give a little speech about themselves and about their day in front of two experimenters who kind of gave them stern faces, like they didn't really respond or give them, you know, any feedback or nodded or smiled, right? And so they engaged in that in about for like, I think 3 minutes or 4 minutes or something like that. And then they were asked to kind of sit down. So it was like, it tasks, obviously, their cognition, you know, at age, these are 4 to 6 year olds, so definitely engaged their challenge, like they had to organize themselves cognitively, but they also had to talk and perform, you know, and so, you know, we don't know what kind of emotions we evoked. You know, the different kids react in a different way. But we were just wondering, like, in that kind of context, and kids are often asked to talk, you know, or answer questions, you know, what would that look like, and how would they recover after they were done with that? Would they be still like aroused and ruminating? Will be.
Really
so.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. So I work locally as a behavioral interventionist, and we work with a population usually has a trauma history, and looking at your research and sort of thinking about it, and with my experience, it's sort of the lack of executive functioning usually occurs. What I found is because they need it as a survival technique during that developmental period to escape whatever was going on. So then my job then becomes to sort of teach these skills that were supposed to be implicitly taught explicitly, of course in the sort of social milieu of a public school, right? I guess my question is whether there's been sort of some research on how like implicit teaching versus sort of explicit teaching, and sort of what how just some research on that. And the other thing I was wondering was, yeah, I guess that's my main question.
Yeah. Did Betsy leave? Yeah, she did. So there's a lot of curricula that have been developed for this, right, and engaged, and some of them are very much explicit, like, you know, teaching kids to stop, breathe, calm themselves, figure out what the options are. But, you know, the reason why I said Betsy is because, you know, she's looking at exercise. There's a lot of people interested in, like, what about just dancing or playing an instrument, or like back to the slides where I was telling you about the play and engagement, right? And so there's a lot of ways in which you could teach this set of skills implicitly by focusing on regulation of positive arousal, right? Or learning in the context of something that's very joyful and something that's really exciting, right? And so anything from, learning to play an instrument to dancing to engaging in the physical activity, martial arts. So the people have tried different things and, with success. So, I'm not up to speed with all the kind of options, but I would, suggest something like that, in the context of just looking at executive functioning, rather than, there's other stuff than in terms of a diet and emotion regulation and other things.
This sort of piggybacks on what this man was just saying. I've seen studies also for those kids who have lower executive function because of some of the trauma issues or lack of stimulation in their environment, whether it's because of poverty or what's happened to them. They also have very developed, the different part of their brain that deals with that emergency problem solving, the fight or flight, the warning alert system, that they have highly developed, that is highly developed. And so that as they grow, they become almost more adaptable, more accepting to traumatic experiences, which is not a good thing, but it is a resilience factor. And when you look at the brain scans of those kids or those youth who might have the higher executive functionings, they do not have those other skills, and they might tend to have some of those more helicopter parents who problem solve and navigate and negotiate with them. And I just wonder if you came across any of that in any of your studies about the impact of.
Yeah, well, there's an impact on experiencing trauma and stress and having that elevated stress arousal, right? Which cannot, basically this back to that allostatic load and allostasis, right? And so there's two different profiles. There's a profile of children who experience a lot of trauma, unpredictability in their lives, and they have this elevated hyperarousal, right? And their cortisol is through the roof, and they're really, and we know that highly elevated cortisol can affect brain development and myelination of the areas that support this set of skills. And so I think in that context, we should be paying attention a lot more to that day-to-day arousal. And so one of the things that we're pursuing currently as a grant is getting educators to think about what is the optimal arousal when these kids come to learn, right? And so let's say they come from very conflictual families or very dangerous background or something, and they're in that classroom at 8 a.m. or 7 a.m., whatnot, and they are completely not prepared to pay attention or study, right? And so we're interested in, can we do in some very micro ways, start looking at how do we get these kids just calm and focused in the moment. Maybe not any longer than 10 minutes, but just for 10 minutes, And can we slowly build that? Can we even start getting teachers to pay attention to physiology as an important factors of biologically being ready to learn, right? Being present there. And so that's those are the things. I'm not familiar with that, but we do have currently a grant in process to trying to start paying attention to that population as they come to the school, because they do spend a lot of time in school, and that's one way in which we can intervene.
So I'd like to thank Jelena again so much. I know there's other questions, but let's give her another round of applause.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming and talking. Thanks to all of you for coming and attending. Please remember, we do have a reception right now in the Fireplace Lounge. We'll be back over there, so please feel free to join us. Come talk to Jelena in a more intimate environment and enjoy some food and drink. Thanks again.